And we are live. Hi there, I'm Dr. Jason Day. Thank you so much for joining us and spending these moments with us. While we let these parents jump on, wow, there's a lot of you. While we let these people jump on for the next minute, I want to strongly encourage you to go ahead and remove those distractions from the room. Close out the Facebook, turn the TV off, get the kids squared away, because today is not just about bringing awareness to a topic. It's about giving you the action steps that can radically change your child's life. As I mentioned, I'm Dr. Jason Day. Thank you again for joining us. I've been blessed to share this message of hope and healing and of science on countless stages all across the country, but I am so thankful that technology is finally catching up with our mission to get this message out to as many parents and providers as possible. And you know what? Whether I'm talking to a professional, to a therapist, or to a parent, the message is still the same. You know, I've said over the years that if parents could receive credit hours for the amount of time they spent researching these topics, they would have a double PhD by now. So the message tonight is in no way, shape, or form going to be diluted. We're going to be diving deep into the science. But what I love about this topic is that I don't have to give you opinions, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the reason I do this, my why behind this, is these 5 little guys right here. This is Oliver, Elijah, Finn, Jace, and our recent addition by adoption, Mr. Silas. And they are why I do what I do. And it's not because I want to provide this amazing life for them, but I have a front row seat to their amazing life. Things like sensory issues or weak immune systems or poor sleep or anxiety, they just haven't touched our home, and there's a reason for that. When I grew up in the early 1980s, there was always that one kid in class that was kind of sickly. There was that one kid in class that was kind of pudgy. But if we fast forward 30 years, there's just one kid in class that doesn't have a diagnosis. There's one kid in class that isn't taking a prescription medication. And there's a reason for that. And the idea that it's our genetics, it's kind of absurd. Our genetics haven't changed that much over the last 30 years, or 30,000 years to be that matter. Why on earth are we seeing these meteoric rises and these challenges? And as I mentioned before, you're not going to hear any soapboxes tonight. It's not one thing. But the notion that we don't understand what's going on with a child with autism or anxiety or sensory processing disorder or why they got there is simply not true. We know what's causing it, and it's not one thing. But here's the facts. 1 in less than 50 boys have autism. 1 in 9 children have asthma. 1 in 6 will be learning disabled. 1 in 4 children have chronic illnesses. 1 in 5 have a defined mental disorder. Is anybody okay with that? I mean, obviously that's a radical shift in the wrong direction. And there's a reason for that, and it's not our genetics. It's definitely not our awareness. The idea that all of those numbers have shifted in that direction simply because doctors have become better at diagnosing these things, it just doesn't make any sense. As if a mother in 1970 wouldn't have known her child had autism or something was disconnected. As if teachers, as if professionals, as if parents wouldn't have known these things. It just doesn't add up. But before we dive in deeper, I want to give an awareness test for all of you out there. Pay attention, very close attention to the video below.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the Moonwalking Bear?
Go!
So anybody out there in the computer world, did you guys see the Moonwalking Bear? Because that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Sometimes we're so focused on symptoms, sometimes we're so focused on all the outside distraction and noise that we literally miss a Moonwalking Bear right center stage. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. There's nothing new. There's nothing soapbox or controversial in this discussion. We're going to be talking about the facts that have literally been dancing right in front of you the entire time. In so many situations, especially dealing with sensory disorders, there's so many pieces to this puzzle. But the puzzle sits on top of a foundation, and we're going to be talking about that foundation today that has ultimately led to what we call the perfect storm. What is the perfect storm? The perfect storm is a myriad of stressors, physical, chemical, emotional stressors that are pushing and pushing and pushing in on our kids' brain and nerve system, ultimately kicking into fight or flight. But you got to remember the fight or flight spectrum is the sensory spectrum, the sympathetic spectrum, the actual spectrum of spectrum disorders. And that's exactly what we're going to be diving in today. Awareness is key, so we have to discover what are the types of stressors that are stressing our kids and babies out. We call them the 3 T's. Now, what is the first T? The first T is traumas, physical types of stressors. In utero constraint, birth trauma is quite possibly the most overlooked childhood epidemic facing our kids today. Forceps, vacuum extractions are incredibly common, especially with C-sections. And once they're out, we have car seats that aren't necessarily built for kids' spines. Baby Bjorns do not put kids in an optimal position. Bounce seats or bumbo seats, these are all physical types of stressors. But let's say that they had a perfect birth, that they didn't have these types of stressors. Kids will be kids. And if your kids are anything like my 5 boys, I jokingly say my primary role as a parent, at least right now, is to keep them alive. They daily try to kill themselves in very creative ways. I'll give them that. And actually, we have a video below there. We certainly don't have time to go into it. But growing up as a kid, one of my favorite TV shows was America's Funniest Home Videos. And it was a constant highlight reel of people just wiping out. And I just took so much delight in that as a kid, seeing people wipe out on a regular basis. But now that I'm actually a pediatric chiropractor and I know what's going on underneath there, it's not so funny anymore. Kids stress themselves out physically, and sometimes that disconnect or stress begins in utero or on day 1. We're going to dive much deeper into that in the very near future, but hang on to that thought. The second type of stress, or the second T, is toxins or chemical type of stressors. Preservatives, pesticides, processed foods are everywhere. Sugar, grains, and dairy are like the hallmark and foundation of the American diet. Environmental chemicals are also everywhere. Pitocin has had a direct connection and link to sensory issues. There's been studies on that. Epidurals, antibiotics are passed out like candy. Now, vaccines will be a controversial topic probably to the end of time, but I have personally taken care of kids that have been injured by vaccines. That's not a shot at vaccines. There's not a single medication in the world, including Tylenol, that says they can be perfectly safe for everybody. Does the risk outweigh the reward? I take care of a little girl that deals with seizures, and her mother is actually a medical doctor that administers vaccines. And I support that choice and support that decision for that doctor and that mom. But without a doubt, it's been documented that she did have a bad reaction to those vaccines. So we pay tribute to those moms that know something has happened on that end, which brings us to the third T, or the third type of stressor, which is thoughts or emotional types of stressors. A stressful or fear-based pregnancy is sometimes the very beginning of it all. Now, what's the book that every mom gets when she finds out she's expecting? That's right, What to Expect When You're Expecting. Does anybody out there know who the author of that book is? I jokingly say it's Stephen King because it's easily one of the most scariest, terrifying books I've ever read in my entire life. It basically catalogs everything that's wrong with pregnancy, everything that's going to go wrong with your pregnancy, and why you should freak out about it every single step of the way. But you got to remember that the neurology of the mother is the neurology of the baby. It's shared. So if a mom's stressed, baby's stressed as well. A stressful, forced emergency deliveries, NICU stays, a fast-paced, high-stress lifestyle, and honestly, bullying. If we're going to be honest with ourselves, these kids are different. They're incredibly special. They're unique. But that difference is noticed by a lot of people, including teachers and students, and a lot of times they're put to the side of the classroom or the back of the classroom, and different grabs in a type of attention that just doesn't work out for these kids, which in many cases leads to bullying. So you have these 3 types of stressors that are pushing and pushing and pushing in. But what are they pushing in on? They're pushing in on the brain and the nerve system. And whenever that brain and nerve system is overwhelmed, it kicks into fight or flight. It leads to a disconnect that we call subluxation. And honestly, I truly do not care if you remember the word subluxation. Think of it as disconnect. And there are signs of this disconnect, sometimes from the birth. A traumatic birth or constraint is all but a guarantee for this type of disconnect. Plagiocephaly, asymmetries, or the flat back of the head, those are misshapen heads for a reason. How much pressure and stress do you think it takes to misshape a baby's head? Difficulty nursing or torticollis, ear infections, reflux, colic, constipation. Why on earth would I put all these on the same row? Well, there is a powerful nerve in the body called the vagus nerve, V-A-G-U-S. And it's the ultimate brake pedal For the gas pedal, it is the fight or flight response. When the vagus nerve is irritated, damaged, or stressed, it just doesn't work as well. And now we have this Ferrari stressed out type brain with bicycle brakes, which leads to weak immune system, which leads to weak digestion, which leads to all of these challenges: ear infections, reflux, colic, and constipation. Sitting or crawling challenges is next on the list. Decreased range of motion, spasm, hypertonicity, a weakness, a poor core, poor balance and coordination is the hallmark of a child with sensory processing disorder. And honestly, this is why I'm having the discussion. I'm a chiropractor, and some people think, well, what the heck does a sensory issue have to do with a guy that fixes people bad backs? Well, honestly, chiropractic is not about your back. It's about the nerve system. It's about the brain. It's about that brain-body connection and optimizing that from day one. Chiropractors are not back doctors. They're nerve doctors. And here's a brilliant quote by a brilliant man. His name's Bruce Lipton. He's a stem cell biologist. And he says that the function of the nerve system is to perceive the environment and coordinate the behavior of all other cells. Why did we include this quote? Well, it's like page one. It's sentence one in all biology textbooks. We have to start somewhere, and that beginning point is the nerve system. But how well does a child with autism perceive his environment? Yeah, not too well. How well does a child with sensory processing disorder coordinate anything? Yeah, it's problematic. So if you have an issue with perception or coordination, I guarantee you it is rooted in neurology. There's a balance going on with this nerve system. There's this thing called the autonomic nervous system. It's the automatic parts of you that are working without you having to think about it. And there are two major divisions of that autonomic nervous system: sympathetics and parasympathetics. We're diving deeper, but pay attention with me. Stay with me here. It's very important. Sympathetics is the fight or flight spectrum, the sensory spectrum, the actual spectrum of spectrum disorders. Parasympathetics is the brake pedal to that stress response. But what happens when the body's overwhelmed with traumas, toxins, thoughts? It leads to that disconnect. A nervous system and brain that's stuck in disconnect opens the door for chronic stress response, which is the sensory spectrum disorder, which is autism, which is anxiety, which is headaches, which is a weak immune system, which is digestive challenges, which is all these issues overwhelming a brain that's stuck in fight or flight. As you can see, it's all about balance. Sympathetics are not a bad thing. Parasympathetics aren't necessarily a good thing. It's about those being in balance. And when a nervous system is stuck on fight or flight, we've shifted way towards sympathetics and overwhelmed the brain with nociception. So now we're understanding a little bit more about the causes, the 3 T's: traumas, toxins, and thoughts. But what happens when that nervous system becomes disconnected and overwhelmed? What's the neurological impact that we've labeled the 5 D's, and how on earth do we correct this? Well, we'll dive into the first D, which is a physical type of disconnect. Subluxation occurs when a joint becomes misaligned and fixated, losing its ability to go through proper ranges of motion, which is the first D, dyskinesia. Dys means abnormal, kinesia means movement. It's just not moving too well. In his research, Dr. Gutman found that spinal injury was present in 80% of the infants he examined shortly after birth, causing interference to the neurologic and immune function. Now, why on earth would a nerve system distraction or irritation affect the immune system? Well, let's think of why fight or flight might be a good thing. Think of a caveman a long, long time ago. If he's by the watering hole and a giant tiger jumps out to eat him, how on earth would it be important to fight a cold if you're about to fight a tiger? Why would it be important to digest breakfast if you're about to beat breakfast? If we were to take a survey of 1,000 kids with sensory issues, do you think ear infections, colic, constipation, weak immune system, chronic sickness, those are exponentially higher than the average healthier population? Now we know why. Because when a nervous system is stuck in fight or flight, the major energy suckers, that is the digestive system and immune system, are just put on the back burner. The thing with fight or flight, it's perfectly good for moments. It's absolutely detrimental if your brain and body stay stuck in fight or flight. And that is where these kids live. We have a short video of where this disconnect, this physical disconnect, begins with so many people. A lot of cases, it begins on the first day. Subluxation in the infant has been associated with the stress experienced at birth, particularly as a result of interventions like C-sections, forceps, vacuum extractions. These are not rare things. I hopped on YouTube to look at a typical, what I call a whistle while you work C-section. I say that because the doctor's literally whistling while he's working. But I want you to notice in this video what this child's first moments of life were like. You'll see him pumping. What he's pumping is actual vacuum that's stuck on a very delicate, still forming head. and then they start to pull this baby out, and you hear him go, all right. He's actually putting some force on that. The medical literature tells us that the average C-section puts upwards of 60 to 80 pounds of pulling on a baby's neck and head. Is anybody okay with that? Because that's not just about a joint. It's not just about a muscle. What about the brainstem? What about that powerful vagus nerve? What about the brain? What about the stress response? And as if that was not enough, I want you to see that the other doctor in record time swoops in and clamps that cord. Now the cord, the umbilical cord, continues to pump for about 15 or 20 minutes after the birth process. Do you know why? What is it pumping? Everything in the body happens for an intelligent reason. A lot of times we go against that intelligence, but what is it pumping? It's actually pumping blood. It's actually pumping tons of nutrients, food to that baby to start his life off. Now, does a mother's milk come in immediately? Of course not. Sometimes it's a few days later, but who cares? We've got this amazing last meal pumping in, but with this baby, you'll see that his head is twisted and torqued, and he's literally lifted out by the weight of his head alone, no support underneath that. That's a physical assault on the nervous system, and the last meal's cut off. It's not a radical thought that this baby's first few moments are definitely spent in that sympathetic fight or flight. Watch this video below.
Getting irritated. Oh, there you go, little fella.
Come on, buddy.
All right. Ears of a girl. Ears of a girl. Make you cute for the camera.
Oh, he's mad. Keep coming back. He did good.
There he goes.
All right.
Look at those big old testicles, though. Bottom of a boy. Bottom of a boy.
Yeah.
Well, he sure had a big head here. Yeah, that was the problem. The head.
Again, I want to say, is anybody okay with that? And again, obviously that video is pretty graphic, but that's not rare. That's how these babies are born in so many cases. But what are they pulling on? Like I said, it's not just the joint. It's not the muscles. It's the brainstem. It's not a stretch to think that this baby's first few moments are stuck in fight or flight, but is this baby able to bounce back? That's where it starts with so many of these kids. Which brings us to the next D. Obviously, this baby's body's going to be stressed out, and that body has to communicate to the brain. Any conversation between body and brain is called affrontation. But when we have overwhelming stressful messages bombarding the brain, that's a disaffrontation. Now that proprioception is way on the back burner. No positive healing developmental messages. It's replaced with nociception. Movement stimulation, especially from the spine, literally charges your brain's batteries. Think about it. Even as an adult, one of the most immediate ways we can charge our brain is to get up and move. We've all been in those moments in our life where we're stuck in a car or stuck in an office or stuck in a meeting for hours on end, and at some point that brain fog starts to set in. That's a lack of proprioception. That's a lack of movement. One of the best ways we can actually recharge the brain is just get up and shake it out. Naturally, that's going to charge the body's brain, but how well do you think that child's brainstem and spine is moving? It's incredibly important that that's able to move because the spine is responsible for 60% of all those positive healing developmental messages input into the brain. The upper cervical spine contains over a third of those messages, that tiny little area that was torqued and twisted. And if you need another visual, this again is the start for so many of these kids. That's a stressor. That's a big deal. Which leads us to the third D, dysautonomia. The brain has to do something with those messages. Garbage into the brain leads to garbage out. Now, dysautonomia is defined as a state of imbalance or dysfunction of the autonomic nerve system, which controls the organs, it controls the glands, it controls the blood vessels. But when that brain is overwhelmed with stress, all that garbage, stressful messages lands back in the body. Dysautonomia is the world of autism. It's the world of sensory processing disorder. That brain-body connection is simply not working as well. That gas pedal is being revved and revved and revved, and the brakes have been cut. Here's another brilliant quote by that brilliant stem cell biologist, Bruce Lipton. He says, you cannot be in a growth or developmental mode and protective mode at the same time. The fight or flight spectrum, the sensory spectrum, is a protective mode. The reason that these kids miss so many of these milestones is because their brain is literally spinning in that sympathetic overdrive. Which leads us to the next D, dysponesis, errors in energy output. Now I understand these words are getting pretty technical, but I guarantee you've seen them before. I want to give you the medical definition of what dysponesis is, but I want to make it very real for all the parents out there because this describes the day in and day out experience with these kids so many times. Dyskinesis is defined as a reversible physiological state consisting of unnoticed, misdirected neurophysical reactions to various agents and the repercussions of these reactions throughout the entire organism. Wow, that's a pretty hefty definition, but let's make it real for you again. It's defined as a reversible, thank God we can reverse these things, state consisting of unnoticed, misdirected neurophysical reactions, meaning overwhelming reactions, stress, anxiety, meltdowns due to environmental events, bodily sensations, emotions, and thoughts, meaning I don't like the way this shirt feels. I'm going to have a meltdown. I don't like the lights in this room. It's too noisy in here. I don't like the way this food feels in my mouth, so I'm going to throw up. These are repercussions throughout what they call the entire organism. The organism is your kid. It's an overwhelmed nervous system that just lands throughout the entire body, leading to that stressed out response. It's a complete disorganized energy. It's a complete loss of symmetry and connection between that brain and body, which leads us to the final D. And honestly, it might be the most important D, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. It's disconnected kids. The only common denominator with every school shooting from Columbine to today is these medications. Now, there will be endless debates, and there should be, on gun control, on security, on what teachers can do, on what parents can do. But the common denominator with every one of these school shootings are these powerful medications. And this is straight out of the Bible from the medical world, the physician's desk reference, that antidepressants increase the risk of suicidal thinking and behavior, known as suicidality, in children, adolescents, and young adults in short-term studies of major depressive disorders and other psychiatric disorders. You got to remember that in many cases, sensory issues, ADHD, are defined as psychiatric disorders. Anyone considering the use of antidepressants in a child, adolescents, or young adult must balance this risk of suicidality with clinical need. Here's an article from the New York Times not too long ago. 1 in 5 high school age boys have been diagnosed with ADHD, and over 2/3 of them are on these powerful medications. Sales of Adderall have more than doubled over a 5-year period to over $9 billion. A recent government survey found that up to 30% of these drugs are being shared with their friends. Did you know that Adderall is one of the most abused drugs on college campuses today? You simply cannot abuse something that's good for you. We have to take the long, hard look of what's the cost of taking these medications over a long period of time, because honestly, the FDA hasn't taken that look. The safety and efficacy of these drugs have never been tested longer than a 6-month period. But I've known a lot of kids that have not just taken these for 6 months, but for 6 years, for 10 years, for decades. We have to look at what's going on with these kids. I certainly don't have time to dive into the depth of this article, but it was a brilliant quote coming from an article, a scientific journalist named Donna Jackson Nakazawa, and she suffered debilitating issues with an autoimmune disorder. But listen to her quote, and she wasn't talking about autism. She wasn't talking about ADHD or sensory issues, but she was. But here's her quote. My physician explained that ongoing adversity in childhood leads to a chronic state of fight or flight or freeze. Researchers at Yale had recently shown that when inflammatory stress hormones flood the child's body and brain, they literally alter the genes that oversee our stress reactivity, resetting the stress response to high for life. This increases the risk of inflammation, which manifests later in cancer, heart disease, and autoimmune diseases like mine. She's talking about what happens when we get stuck here way out in the future. But what about right now? What's going on with our kids right now? A nervous system that's stuck in the fight or flight response, the sympathetic response, the sensory response is a child with sensory issues. It is a child with autism. It is a child with sensory processing disorder. It is a child with anxiety. It's a spectrum. It can manifest in so many different ways, but every single one of these issues is rooted in a neurology and a brain that's stuck in fight or flight. So what do we do about it? What can we do? So now you're starting to see this thing that is the perfect storm. And the forecast is autism, ADHD, anxiety, sensory processing disorder, allergies, asthma, chronic illness. But how do we get here? In so many cases, it began with that fear and intervention-based pregnancy, which led to that intervention birth injury or subluxation. How well do you think that baby's going to be sleeping? How well do you think his digestive system's going to be working? That's called colic. If that neck is jacked and twisted and torqued and irritated, he's going to have neck issues, difficulty nursing, which typically leads to formula fed. Thank God for formula when we need it. But in no way, shape, or form will it ever be breast milk, will it ever be specifically designed for that child. 60 plus vaccinations. Many people can argue maybe too much too soon. I had, I think, 5 or 6 vaccines as a child. But how well does that immune system work? And now we're leading to chronic ear infections because the immune system's tanked, the plumbing is jacked. Chronic ear infections leads to one thing, antibiotics. Even though in early 1980, the Pediatric Society overwhelmingly agreed that not only do antibiotics not help with ear infections, they actually set the child up for immune system failure. Your gut thrives off a healthy balance of flora. Flora is another word for bacteria. What do you think antibiotics do to bad bacteria or good bacteria? Doesn't care, wipes them all out, and that's why your child has diarrhea. What are we doing to that immune system every time we take antibiotics? Which leads to childhood, toxic food and environment. If I was to give you a list of the top 10 foods kids love, it's probably 10 things you should never eat. There are so many things that can stress a child's nervous system and brain out, and it could be any one of those. And in so many cases, it's like all of the above for these kids. But I didn't want to just leave you with information and awareness. I want to leave you with some hope. There is hope, and his name's Evan. Now, Evan's mother had a perfectly healthy pregnancy, but on his birthday, it was noted that he was lodged, which led to a rushed emergency C-section. And immediately after that, Evan had twitching. And what is that twitching possibly? Well, maybe it's a seizure, something neurological. So, of course, they did a battery of tests, and he had a regular vaccination schedule up to 1 year. But mom noticed in those first 3 years that something's not right. Something's disconnected. And she honestly used a word to describe her child that haunts me to this day. She described her child as vacant. When she looked in his eyes, she saw vacancy. Now, as a doctor, I understand that, but as a parent, it broke my heart because when I look at my child's eyes, I want to see connection. I want to see a spirit. I want to see a future. I want to see happiness. I want to see love. I want to see that connection that every parent strives for and desires. But what she saw was vacant. And I understand why. And if a picture's worth 1,000 words, we'll show you a few of those. These were the first few moments of Evan's life. And I'd love to say that those wires were gently placed on his head, but they had to get to the root of this. Why is Evan twitching? You can see that his first few moments, and honestly, the first week of his life was one of disconnect. Instead of being at his mother's chest and nursing and connecting, he was on a slab. He was being tested, and they're trying to figure out why Evan had twitching. And after about a week, no more twitching, Evan's fine. But Evan was not fine. And Evan's parents took their son to the leading doctors in the area when he was 3.5 years old and came away with a diagnosis of autism. He was mostly nonverbal, unable to follow directions, poor to little eye contact with his parents, very emotional. And the doctors told the mothers this: you need to get okay with the idea that this kid's going to need to be institutionalized around age 16 or 17 for his safety and for yours. That is never a message a parent wants to receive. That's obviously a message of disconnect. And I said a picture's worth 1,000 words, but watch this video of a day in the life of Evan at age 3.5, diagnosed with autism.
Bye, Aunt Kristen. See you later.
No.
No? Did you have fun? Did you have fun? Yes? Yes? Do you love Aunt Kristen? Say yes. Yeah? What? Bye, Aunt Kristen. We'll see you later.
You see that mother desperately trying to connect with her child, but what she's left is with a vacant child. You can see the frustration in that baby's eyes. And honestly, as a provider, when I started this work and helping these kids, seeing kids like Evan, I thought, my God, how frustrating and challenging that must be for a parent. How frustrating and challenging is that for a provider or specialist to help this kid? But then it dawned on me, how horrible is that for Evan? How terrifying is that? As parents, we all have our stressful moments. We have contacts. We have resources. We have adaptation skills to get around these bad moments. But every single moment of Evan's life was one of disconnect, of overwhelm, of stress. How challenging is that for these kids? I get it now. But these types of challenges, these types of irritations are not something that we would ever guess at. We utilize a state-of-the-art technology that objectively measures that brain-body connection. And here's one of those scans for Evan. This is a scan that uses thermography. There's no radiation. There's nothing invasive. These scans are perfectly safe. But what it's measuring is inflammation along that spinal cord. Now with this scan, white's a good thing. Green's a mild irritation. Blue is a problem. Red is severe. Now you do not have to be a doctor or a specialist to look at the scan and say, that is messed up. That is disconnected. You can see that gigantic red bar by the brainstem. That is a nervous system that's stuck in fight or flight. Look at the even bigger one down in his gut area. His gut is completely inflamed and overwhelmed. And we began the hard, tedious, specific work of unwinding this nervous system. Now, an adjustment for a child is a gentle, super specific proprioceptive input into that brainstem, into that spinal cord, relieving and removing that type of stress so that the body can go into healing mode, so that it can go into parasympathetic, so that it can go into connected adaptation mode. And after 2 weeks, we began to see some major changes in this child. After 2 weeks, he fell asleep in the parking lot for about 15 hours. Now, bear in mind, he probably hasn't slept that well because he's been stuck in fight or flight for 3.5 years. 15 hours is a nap after all of that. He began talking more within days, imitating speech for the first time, playing with his brother and sister, imitating their play, doing funny things to purposely engage with his family. Now, the last two always get a raised eyebrow, but when you understand neurology and how the body and brain works, this is a really good thing. He started pooping a ton and developed a fever. Why on earth would that be a good thing? His immune system is finally waking up. It's fighting back. The way the body fights back against a lot of these irritations and inflammations is to raise the temperature, which is called a fever. That's actually a good thing. Why would his body start pooping a ton? Parasympathetics are engaged. The gut is finally waking up. It's removing all those toxins that have just been lodged and stuck for so long. And like I said, we want to see the changes. You can see it in this video. Check this out.
Is that a bird?
A good bird.
Tweet, tweet. What's that one?
Goody!
What is it?
Goody!
A dog?
Yes, I am.
Yep.
And a truck.
What's that?
A truck.
A truck?
A fast truck.
Fast truck.
A flash. The flash. So fast. What's a truck?
What's that one?
A cupcake!
No, this one. What's this one?
A snake!
A snake.
A good noise again.
Yeah? Oh! Show me what a snake says.
A girl with a fish.
What does a snake say?
Meow.
Now, honestly, I could have played that video on mute and you see a different child. Look at the light in his eyes. That is a different kid. That is a connected kid. And in no way, shape, or form am I treating autism or am I treating sensory processing disorder. In no way did I heal him. But when you unlock and remove those irritations between brain and body, miracles happen. The body and the brain healed itself. And he's lost his diagnosis of autism. I'm happy to report that today he's speaking in full sentences. He's exploding with development in speech. He's sleeping better, behaving better. He's potty trained, never sick. He's totally back on track and at the head of his class. Honestly, this is why I do what I do. This is why I love what I do, so that Evan and his family and families just like yours have some hope, have a future, have a connected future, so that that vacancy turns to connection, that that frustration turns to a future. And I know as a parent, you might be wondering, could my kid be having one of these irritations? Could it be something as simple and powerful as that? Well, today's webinar is not about leaving you wondering. I want to leave you with an opportunity. And that opportunity is to get checked. We get our eyes checked, our ears checked, our teeth checked. Why on earth are we not checking the most important system of the body that regulates all of this thing called life? And that's the opportunity I'm leaving with you today. I want to thank you for sticking with us this entire time. I can't think of anything more important than your child's health, than your family's health. I understand that you have questions. You should. Let's start that conversation right now. You have some options moving forward. That full examination is not just a thermal scan. We also do an EMG scan, which measures the electrical tone of that neuromuscular junction. What that basically measuring is that system in complete stress mode? We also have a test that cardiologists developed over 10 years ago that measure the fight or flight response objectively. We put all three of these technologies together to lay out a clear blueprint of exactly what's going on, what you need to do about it, how long that'll take, and how much that'll cost. All of that's laid out up front to empower you as a parent to make the decision that's best for your family and for your child's future. That full examination typically takes about 45 minutes, and it's typically $150. The special we have for anybody watching this webinar is just for $85. The one caveat to that special is that I ask that you reach out to us right now. Reach out with your questions. Reach out to schedule an appointment right now, whether that's appointment for a consultation and examination or the conversation. I'm happy to start that conversation right now. I can't think of anything more important than this. So take action, ask questions. Let's continue the conversation. Thank you so much for tuning in. I look forward to connecting with you soon. Bye, everybody.